that's better. Closer to home is Acts 9:4, Acts 22:7, and Acts 26:14. The story of Saul's conversion itself. Acts 9:4. And he fell to the earth and heard a voice, Phanin, saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Acts 22:7. And I fell unto the ground and heard a voice, saying unto me, Acts 26:14. And when we were all fallen to the earth, I heard a voice, speaking unto me. Notice the different cases. Paul himself telling the same story in the same context uses two different cases. They cannot have two different meanings. In fact, the New International Version and the Living Bible agree, translating both the accusative and the genitive as voice in all three instances. If the apologists are correct when they say that the differences in each case produces different words in Act 9:7 and Acts 22:9, then the above example shows Paul contradicting himself. The apologists have shot themselves in the foot. To be fair, there are places where phone can allowably be translated as sound, but context rather than case determines this. Phone is used 140 times in the New Testament. It's translated as voice 131 times in the King James Version. The other 9 times it is translated as sound or noise, but each of these is clearly figurative, referring to something that is not a person. The noise phone of thunder, the sound phone of wind, wings, etc. Notice that although the King James Version translates Revelation 6:1 as sound of thunder, the New Revised Standard Version, the New International Version, and the Living Bible stick with voice. Here, where there actually is a poetic justification for using sound and a different case from the accusative, it is not taken. I think the literal voice of thunder, a more interesting way of speaking, is more respectful of the poetic intention of the writer than sound of thunder. Neither thunder nor wind actually have a voice, but in Acts 9:7, there is no such poetic context. In fact, Luke goes out of his way to insist that it was a person, quote, hearing a voice but seeing no man. If Paul's men thought they heard an impersonal voice or an impersonal noise like thunder or wind, then it would not have been necessary to add the phrase, but seeing no man. Why would the New International Version and the Living Bible use sound in Acts 9:7 instead of voice? There is no linguistic or contextual reason. It appears those evangelical translators are simply trying to paper over a discrepancy. The New International Version and the Living Bible translators cannot claim a new, more advanced understanding of Greek. The newly revised Standard Version was published after the New International Version and the Living Bible, and it uses the literal voice in Acts 9:7. The motives of the New International Version and the Living Bible translators are made clear in the preface to each book. The NIV, translated by a team of evangelical scholars, instigated by the National Association of Evangelicals, is introduced with these words, quote, we offer this version of the Bible to him in whose name and for whose glory it has been made. We pray that it will lead many into a better understanding of the Holy Scriptures and a fuller knowledge of Jesus Christ, the incarnate Word, of whom the Scriptures so faithfully testify. If there is a contradiction in the New Testament, then it could not faithfully testify anything. The NIV team was extremely selective in choosing its scholars. Quote, the translators were united in their commitment to the authority and infallibility of the Bible as God's word in written form. They believe that it contains the divine answer to the deepest needs of humanity, that it sheds light on our path in a dark world, and that it sets forth the way to our eternal well-being, end quote. This is not the agenda of a team of objective scholars. This is evangelism. If there is a contradiction in the Bible, the NIV translators, who were confessedly committed a priori to infallibility, could never see it. Some skeptics might be tempted to use the phrase, there is none so blind as he who will not see. I would never stoop to such ad hominem attack. The Living Bible does not claim to be a strict translation. It is a paraphrase by Dr. Kenneth Taylor, who admits in its preface, quote, When the Greek or Hebrew is not clear, then the theology of the translator in his guide, along with the sense of logic, the theological lodestar in this book has been a rigid evangelical position. The theology of the translator is his guide. In Acts 9:7, there's no lack of clarity. Phones is voice. But if your theology dictates that the Bible must contain no errors, then a perfectly simple translation that results in a contradiction becomes unclear, and you have to resort to sleight of hand to repair the damage to your theology. What if an atheistic or skeptical organization were to translate the Bible, putting together a team of staunch materialists, systematically excluding conservative or evangelical scholars, announcing a rigid skeptical position, claiming to be, quote, united in our commitment to the fallibility of the Bible, end quote, and advertising the, quote, hope that this translation will lead many astray from faith into a solid doubt of the reliability of the scriptures, end quote? The evangelicals would scream. Okay, so would real scholars. Such prejudice clearly would taint the objectivity of the process. One of the most popular evangelical verses is Revelations 3:20. Quote, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice, phones, and open the door, I will come into him. Gross. Blah. Anyway, the genitive case is used here, as it is in Acts 9:7, yet the NIV uses voice, and the Living Bible says, here's me calling. Neither uses knocking or sound. These evangelical translators are not consistent. They only invoke the ad hoc and faulty genitive case argument when it suits their inerrancy agenda. Let's face it, Acts 9:7 and Acts 22:9 are contradictory. Writers made mistakes, okay? In their confessed missionary zeal, the translators of the NIV and the Living Bible and other evangelical apologists have dishonestly tampered with the meaning of Scripture using a phony argument in order to deceive the readers and disguise an embarrassing discrepancy in their so-called holy book. Did Jesus exist? In all the years I was a Christian minister, I never preached a sermon about the evidence for a historic Jesus. There was no need for such a sermon. I stood before many congregations and associated with many ministers, evangelists, and pastors, and not one of us ever spoke about the possibility that Jesus was a legend or that his story is more myth than history. We had heard, of course, that there were academic skeptics, but we dismissed them as a tiny fringe of quacks and atheists. In my 4 years of religious study at Azusa Pacific College, I took many Bible classes, an entire course about the book of Romans, another very useful class about Hebrew wisdom literature, and so on. But I was offered only one course in Christian apologetics. It was called Christian Evidences, and I found it to be the least useful of all of my studies. Not that it was a bad class, but it seemed so unnecessary. It provided an answer to a question nobody was asking. Since I preferred evangelism to academics, I found the information mildly interesting and somewhat confirming, though my faith did not need such confirmation, and mainly irrelevant. The class did not delve deeply into the ancient documents. We recited the roster of early historians and read some of the church fathers, and then promptly forgot them all. I figured that Christian scholars had already done the homework, and that our faith rested on a firm historical foundation, and that if I ever needed to look it up, I could turn to some book somewhere for the facts. I just never needed to look it up. But when I became a free thinker, I did decide to look it up, and I was very surprised at what I found, or more precisely, at what I didn't find. And I am now convinced that the Jesus story is a combination of myth and legend, mixed with a little bit of real history unrelated to Jesus. Here's what I found out. 1, there is no external historical confirmation for the New Testament stories. 2, the New Testament stories are internally contradictory. 3, there are natural explanations for the origin of the Jesus legend. 4, the miracle reports make the story unhistorical. The Jesus of history is not the Jesus of the New Testament. A number of scholars and writers, known informally as mythicists, insist that Jesus did not exist at all. Others think there may have existed a self-proclaimed Messiah figure named Yeshua. There were many others. on whom the New Testament story was loosely based. But even so, the latter group considers the exaggerated, miracle working, resurrecting Jesus caricature in the Gospels to be a legend, a literary character produced by a later generation of believers. The legend position amounts to the same thing as myth to most believers who worship only the Jesus of the Gospels. The Gospels, written many decades after the fact, are a blend of fact and fantasy, historical fiction, and although the proportions of the blend may differ from scholar to scholar, no credible historian takes them as 100% face value. Whether myth or legend, the life of Jesus is not corroborated. Not a single word about Jesus appears outside of the New Testament in the entire first century, even though many writers documented firsthand the early Roman Empire in great detail, including careful accounts of the time and place where Jesus supposedly taught. Many Christian writers do claim, however, that there is overwhelming historical testimony for Jesus. At face value, the amount of evidence does appear to be ample. Looking outside of the New Testament, many texts in apologetics will include a long list of names and documents that claim to confirm the story of Jesus, such as Josephus, Suetonius, Pliny, Tacitus, Thallus, Marabar Serapion, I guess that's how you say it, Lucian, Phlegon, Tertullian, Justin Martyr, Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus, Origen, Cyprian, and others. And if you simply rattle off this list, you might be forgiven for saying, wow, I guess that settles it. But then if you ask a few questions, you quickly realize that most of these names can be taken off the list. And if you scratch beneath the surface, they all have to be discarded. Some of these names are church fathers writing in the 2nd to 4th centuries and are therefore too late to be considered reliable for 1st century confirmation. Being church leaders, their objectivity is also questionable. These facts were not important to me as an evangelist, nor would they raise any red flags in the mind of the average believer reading the average book of Christian proofs. The list does, however, include some non-believers, Jewish and Roman writers who are likely not biased towards Christianity. So it would appear that there can be little question about the historical confirmation of Jesus. Still, it is rarely, if ever, pointed out that none of these reports dates from the time of Jesus or even the following generation. Jesus supposedly lived sometime between 4 BCE and 30 CE, but there is not a single contemporary historical mention of Jesus, not by Romans or by Jews, not by believers or by unbelievers, not during his entire lifetime. The earliest candidate for extra biblical confirmation, one small paragraph in Josephus, dates to the mid-90s CE, which is more than 60 years after Jesus supposedly died. Even this turns out to be bogus. The lack of contemporary corroboration does not disprove his existence, of course, but it certainly casts great doubt on the historicity of a man who supposedly had a great impact on the world. Somebody should have noticed. The early years of the Roman Republic is one of the most historically documented times in history. One of the writers alive during the time of Jesus was Philo Judaeus, sometimes just known as Philo of Alexandria. John E. Remsburg in The Christ writes, quote, Philo was born before the beginning of the Christian era and lived until long after the reputed death of Christ. He wrote an account of the Jews covering the entire time that Christ is said to have existed on earth. He was living in or near Jerusalem when Christ's miraculous birth and the Herodian massacre occurred. He was there when Christ made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He was there when the crucifixion, with its attendant earthquake, supernatural darkness, and resurrection of the dead took place, when Christ himself rose from the dead, and in the presence of many witnesses, ascended into heaven. These marvelous events, which must have filled the world with amazement, had they really occurred, were unknown to him. It was Philo who developed the doctrine of the Logos, or Word, and although this Word incarnate dwelt in that very land and in the presence of multitudes, revealed himself and demonstrated his divine powers, Philo saw it not. Philo might be considered the investigative reporter of his day. He was there on location during the early first century, talking with people who should have remembered or at least heard the stories, observing, making notes, documenting. He reported nothing about Jesus. There was also a historian named Justus of Tiberias, who was a native of Galilee, the homeland of Jesus. He wrote a history covering the time when Christ supposedly lived. This history is now lost, but a ninth century Christian scholar named Fontius had read it and wrote, quote, "He, Justus, makes not the least mention of the appearance of Christ, of what things happened to him, or of the wonderful works that he did." Notice that Fontius made the assumption that Justus overlooked Jesus when it is also possible that there was nothing there to overlook in the first place. Flavius Josephus. My dad's birthday My dad's birthday present to me when I turned 19 was a copy of the complete works of Flavius Josephus. When it comes to hard evidence from outside the Bible, this is the most common piece of historical documentation offered by Christian apologists. Outside of the New Testament, Josephus presents the only possible confirmation of the Jesus story from the first century. At first glance, Josephus appears to be the answer to the Christian apologist's dream. He was a Messianic Jew, not a Christian, so he could not be accused of bias. He did not spend a lot of time or space on his report of Jesus, showing that he was merely reporting facts, not spouting propaganda like the gospel writers. Although he was born in 37 CE and could not have been a contemporary of Jesus, he lived close enough to the time to be considered a valuable secondhand source. Josephus was a highly respected and much quoted Roman historian. He died sometime after the year 100. His two major tomes were the Antiquities of the Jews and the Wars of the Jews. Antiquities was written sometime after the year 90 CE. It begins, quote, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth," and arduously parallels the Old Testament up to the time when Josephus is able to add equally tedious historical details of Jewish life during the early Roman period. In Book 18, Chapter 3, this paragraph is encountered. Quote, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. End quote. This truly appears to give historical confirmation for the existence of Jesus. But is it authentic? Most scholars, including most fundamental scholars, admit that at least some parts of this paragraph cannot be authentic. Many are convinced that the entire paragraph is a forgery, an interpolation inserted by Christians at a later time. There was at least 7 reasons for this. Number 1, the paragraph is absent from early copies of the works of Josephus. For example, it does not appear in Origen's 2nd century version of Josephus in Origen contra Chalcedon, where Origen fiercely defended Christianity against the heretical views of Celsus. Origen quoted freely from Josephus to prove his points, but never once used this paragraph, which would have been the ultimate ace up his sleeve. In fact, the Josephus paragraph about Jesus does not appear at all until the beginning of the 4th century, at the time of Constantine. Bishop Eusebius, a close ally of the emperor, was instrumental in crystallizing and defining the version of Christianity that was to become Orthodox, and he is the first person known to have quoted this paragraph of Josephus. Eusebius once wrote that it was a permissible medicine for historians to create fictions, prompting historian Jacob Burckhardt to call Eusebius the first thoroughly dishonest historian of antiquity. The fact that the Josephus Jesus paragraph shows up at this point in history, at a time when interpolations and revisions were quite common, and when the emperor was eager to demolish Gnostic Christianity and replace it with literalistic Christianity, makes the passage quite dubious. Many scholars believe that Eusebius was the forger and interpolator of the paragraph on Jesus that magically appears in the works of Josephus after more than 2 centuries. Number 2, Josephus would not have called Jesus the Christ or the truth. Whoever wrote these phrases was a believing Christian. Josephus was a Messianic Jew, and if he truly believed Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah, the Christ, he certainly would have given more than a passing reference to him. Josephus never converted to Christianity. Origen reported that Josephus was, quote, not believing in Jesus as the Christ. Number 3, the passage is out of context. Book 18, containing the intervals of 32 years from the banishment of Archelaus to the departure from Babylon, starts with the Roman taxation under Cyrenius in 6 CE and talks about various Jewish sects at the time, including the Essenes and a sect of Judas the Galilean, to which the devotees 3 times more space than to Jesus. He discusses Herod's building of various cities, the succession of priests and procurators, and so on. Chapter 3 starts with a sedition against Pilate, who planned to slaughter all the Jews, but changed his mind. Pilate then used sacred money to supply water to Jerusalem. The Jews protested. Pilate sent spies into the Jewish ranks with concealed weapons, and there was a great massacre. Then, in the middle of all these troubles, comes the curiously quiet paragraph about Jesus, followed immediately by, and about the same time, another terrible misfortune confounded the Jews. Josephus, an Orthodox Jew, would not have thought the Christian story to be another terrible misfortune. If he truly thought Jesus was the Christ, this would have been a glorious story of victory. It is only a Christian who might have considered Jesus to be a Jewish tragedy. Paragraph 3 can be lifted out of the text with no damage to the chapter. In fact, it flows better without it. Number 4, the phrase, "to this day," shows that this is a later interpolation. There was no tribe of Christians during Josephus's time. Christianity did not get off the ground until the 2nd century. Number 5, Josephus appears not to know anything else about Jesus outside this tiny paragraph and an indirect reference concerning James, the brother of Jesus. He does not refer to the Gospels now known as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or to the writings or activities of Paul, though if these stories were in circulation at that time, he ought to have known about them and used them as sources. Like the writings of Paul, Josephus's account is silent about the teachings or miracles of Jesus, although he reports the antics of other prophets in great detail. He makes no mention of the earthquake or eclipse at the crucifixion, which would have been universally known in that area if that had truly happened. He adds nothing to the gospel narratives and says nothing that would not have been believed by Christians already, whether in the 1st or 4th century. In all of Josephus's voluminous works, there's not a single reference to Christianity anywhere outside of this tiny paragraph. He relates much more about John the Baptist than about Jesus. He lists the activities of many other self-proclaimed messiahs, including Judas of Galilee, Thaddeus, the magician, and the Egyptian Jew messiah, but is mute about the life of one whom he claims, if he wrote it, is the answer to his messianic hopes. Number 6, the paragraph mentions that the divine prophets foretold the life of Jesus, but Josephus neglects to mention who these prophets were or what they said. In no other place did Josephus connect any Hebrew prediction with the life of Jesus. If Jesus truly had been the fulfillment of divine prophecy, as Christians believe, he would have been the one learned enough to document it. Number 7, the hyperbolic language of the paragraph is uncharacteristic of a careful historian. As the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. This sounds more like sectarian propaganda. In other words, more like the New Testament than objective reporting. It's very unlike Josephus. Christians should be careful when they refer to Josephus as historical confirmation for Jesus. If we remove the forged paragraph, as we should, the works of Josephus become evidence against historicity. Some Christian scholars are honest enough, however, to acknowledge these problems. I mean, how could they not? Agreeing that tampering has occurred. yet insisting that the passage can be undoctored to uncover an original plainer report by Josephus that was later modified by someone like Eusebius. This is not the Bible after all. If we remove the fraudulent, he was the Christ, and to this day, and 10,000 under wonderful things, and so on, we can still spot an unvarnished secondhand recognition of the existence of Jesus, these scholars insist. But then you have to wonder where to draw a line. How do Christians prove it was only part of the paragraph and not the entire thing that was dishonestly added to the antiquities? And even if they can do that, doesn't this prove too much? Instead of raising our confidence in the reliability of ancient writings, doesn't this actually demonstrate that at least some early Christians were eager to falsify documents? I mean, if you admit that there was a propensity for believers to tamper with evidence, how do you know they kept their grubby hands off the New Testament? Those who would try to rescue Josephus with this tactic are shooting themselves in the foot. The Bible has been tampered with, and the argument that saves one damns the other. There is one other passage in the Antiquities that mentions Jesus as an aside. It's in Book 20, Chapter 9. Quote, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was put upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. This is flimsy, and even Christian scholars widely consider this to be a doctored text. The stoning of James is not mentioned in Acts. Hegesippus, a Jewish Christian in 170 CE, wrote a history of the church saying that James, the brother of Jesus, was killed in a riot, not by sentence of a court. Clement confirms this, quoted by Eusebius. Most scholars agree that Josephus is referring to another James here, possibly the same one that Paul mentions in Acts, who led a sect in Jerusalem. Instead of strengthening Christianity, this quote-unquote brother of Jesus interpolation contradicts history. Again, if Josephus truly thought Jesus was the Christ, he would have added more about him than a casual aside in someone else's story. Josephus was a native of Judea and a contemporary of the apostles. He was governor of Galilee for a time, the province in which Jesus allegedly lived and taught. He traversed every part of this province, writes Remsburg, and visited the place where, but a generation before, Christ had performed his prodigies. He resided in Cana, the very city in which Christ is said to have wrought his first miracle. He mentions every noted personage of Palestine and describes every important event that occurred there during the first 70 years of the Christian era. But Christ was of too little consequence and his deeds too trivial to merit a line from this historian's pen. The 2nd century and later. After Josephus, there are other writers who mention Christianity. But even if we're confident that their writings are authentic, they are too late to claim the confirming impact of a 1st century witness. Suetonius wrote a biography called 12 Caesars around the year 112 CE, mentioning that Claudius, quote, banished the Jews from Rome since they had made a commotion because of Chrestus, and that during the time of Nero, punishments were also inflicted on the Christians, a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief. Notice that there's no mention of Jesus by name. It's unlikely that Christianity had spread as far as Rome during the reign of Claudius, or that it was large enough to have caused a revolt. Chrestus does not mean Christ. It was a common name meaning good, used by both slaves and free people, and occurring more than 80 times in Latin inscriptions. Even if Suetonius made a typo and truly meant Christ, he may have been referring only to the Jews in Rome who were expecting a Messiah, not to Jesus of Nazareth. It could have been someone else, maybe a Roman Jew who stepped forward. It's only eager believers who jump to the conclusion that this provides evidence for Jesus. Nowhere in any of Suetonius's writings did he mention Jesus of Nazareth. And even if he had, his history would not necessarily have been reliable. He also reported, for example, that Caesar Augustus bodily rose to heaven when he died, an event that few modern scholars consider historical. In 112 CE, Pliny the Younger said that Christians were singing a hymn to Christ as to a god. That's it. In all of Pliny's writings, we find one small tangential reference, and not even to Christ, but to Christians. Again, notice the absence of the name Jesus. This could have referred to any of the Christs who were being followed by Jews who thought they had found a Messiah. Pliny's report hardly counts as history since he is only relaying what other people believed. Even if this sentence referred to a group of followers of Jesus, no one denies that Christianity was in existence at that time. Pliny, at the very most, might be useful in documenting the religion, but not the historic Jesus. Sometime after 117 CE, the Roman historian Tacitus wrote in his Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44, quote, Nero looked around for a scapegoat and inflicted the most fiendish tortures on a group of persons already hated for their crimes. This was the sect known as Christians. Their founder, one Christus, had been put to death by the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. This checked the abominable superstition for a while, but it broke out again and spread not merely through Judea, where it originated, but even to Rome itself, the great reservoir and collecting ground for every kind of depravity and filth. Those who confessed to being Christians were at once arrested, but on their testimony, a great crowd of people were convicted, not so much on the charge of arson, but of hatred of the entire human race. In this passage, Tacitus depicts early Christians as hated for their crimes and associated with depravity and filth. You know what? I think I agree with Tacitus. I associate Christianity with depravity and filth and poor grammar, for fuck's sake. Anyway, this is not a flattering picture. I agree. But even if it is valid, and it is, it tells us nothing about Jesus of Nazareth. Tacitus claims no first-hand knowledge of Christianity. He's merely repeating the then common ideas about Christians. There is no other historical confirmation that Nero persecuted Christians. Nero did persecute Jews, and perhaps Tacitus was confused about this. There certainly was not a great crowd of Christians in Rome around 60 CE, and the term Christian was not used in the first century. Tacitus is either doctoring history from a distance or repeating a myth without checking his facts. Historians generally agree that Nero did not burn Rome, so Tacitus is in error to suggest that he would have needed a scapegoat in the first place. No one in the second century ever quoted this passage of Tacitus, and in fact, it appears almost word for word in the writings of someone else, Sulpicius Severus, in the 4th century, where it is mixed in with other myths. The passage is therefore highly suspect and adds virtually no evidence for a historic Jesus. In the 9th century, a Byzantine writer named George Syncellus quoted a 3rd century Christian historian named Julius Africanus, who quoted an unknown writer named Thallus on the darkness of the crucifixion. Thallus, in the 3rd book of the history, calls this darkness an eclipse of the sun, but in my own opinion, he is wrong. All of the works of Africanus are lost, so there is no way to confirm the quote or to examine its context. We have no idea who Thallus was or when he wrote. Eusebius mentions a history of Thallus in 3 books ending about 112 CE, so the suggestion is that Thallus might have been a near contemporary of Jesus. There's no historical evidence of an eclipse during the time Jesus was supposedly crucified. The reason Africanus doubted the eclipse is because Easter happens near the full moon, and a solar eclipse would have been impossible at that time. Even ancient skeptics knew that the full moon occurs when it is on the opposite side of the earth from the sun, where it is unable to move between the sun and the earth to produce an eclipse. There's a fragment of a personal letter from a Syrian named Marabar Serapion to his son in prison, of uncertain date, probably 2nd or 3rd century, that mentions that the Jews at that time had killed their quote-unquote wise king. However, the New Testament reports that the Romans, not the Jews, killed Jesus. The Jews had killed other leaders, for example, the Essene teacher of righteousness. If this truly is a report of a historical event rather than the passing on of folklore, it could have been a reference to someone else. It's worthless as evidence for Jesus of Nazareth, yet it can be found in the list of some Christian scholars as proof that Jesus existed. Because they thirsty. Anyway, a second century satirist named Lucian wrote that the basis for the Christian sect was a man who was crucified in Palestine. But this is equally worthless as historical evidence. He's merely repeating what Christians believed in the second century. Lucian doesn't mention Jesus by name. This reference is too late to be considered historical evidence, and since Lucian did not consider himself a historian, neither should we. All of these confirmations of Jesus are at best secondhand hearsay of what others thought to have believed. They would be worthless in a court of law. It would be like a witness to a murder saying, I didn't see the act itself, but I read in a letter from someone who is now dead that they heard from a probably reliable source that someone actually believed that a person with the same or similar name committed the crime. Facts. Hold up, what time is it? Okay, I got a little bit of time. Bottom of the barrel. In addition to Josephus, Suetonius, Tacitus, and the others, there are a handful of highly questionable so-called evidences that some Christians have put forward. These include Tertullian, Phlegon, Justin Martyr, and portions of the Jewish Talmud that mention Jesus in an attempt to discredit Christianity, supposedly showing that even the enemies of Jesus didn't doubt his existence. Though all of these late opinions are flimsy, some Christians make a showy point of listing them with little elaboration in their books of apologetics. Ministers can rattle off these historical confirmations with little fear that their congregations will take the time to investigate their authenticity. I include one other very silly attempt here, the Archco Volume. Not because it has ever come up in any of my debates or has been used by serious Christian apologists, but because it shows the lengths to which some believers will go to prove Christianity and how eagerly some gullible believers swallow such nonsense. And these are modern believers, supposedly more informed and sophisticated than the ancient writers. A Christian actually mailed me a copy of the Archco Volume. This eyewitness testimony supposedly reports authentic first-hand accounts of Jesus from the early first century. It includes letters from Pilate to Rome, glowing interviews of the shepherds outside Bethlehem who visited the baby Jesus in the manger after being awakened by angels, and so on. Its flowery King James prose makes entertaining reading, but it is not considered authentic by any scholar. It was written in the 19th century by a traveling salesman who said he translated it from original documents found in the basement of the Vatican. The translations were mailed overseas in installments after payments for each one was received. No one has ever seen the original documents. In Evidence That Demands a Verdict, Josh McDowell makes an argument that is common among apologists. He says, there are now more than 5,300 known Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Add over 10,000 Latin Vulgate and at least 9,300 other early versions, and we have more than 24,000 manuscript copies of portions of the New Testament in existence today. No other document of antiquity even begins to approach such numbers and attestation. In comparison, the Iliad by Homer is second, with only 643 manuscripts that still survive. Do you see how he's piling on numbers? What do the 10,000 Latin Vulgate copies have to do with original Greek manuscripts? This information might cause believers to applaud with smugness, but it misses the point. What does the number of copies have to do with authenticity? If 1 million copies of the book are printed, does it make it any more truthful? Are the historical facts reported in the Iliad considered reliable? There are currently hundreds of millions of copies of the Quran in existence in many forms and scores of translations. Does the sheer number of copies make it more reliable than, say, a single inscription of an Egyptian sarcophagus? This argument is a smokescreen. There are no original manuscripts of the Bible in existence, so we all agree that we're working from copies of copies. Critics might agree that some current translations of the New Testament are based on a reasonably accurate transcription of variations from early forms of some of the Greek documents. But what does this have to do with authenticity, reliability, or truthfulness? And why are there variations at all? Yeah, scribes sometimes made minor copying errors, but few believers realize how many discrepancies there are among the manuscripts. Bart Ehrman, in Misquoting Jesus, reminds us that there are more variants among the ancient documents than there are words in the New Testament. Another argument made by Josh McDowell and others is the close interval of time between the events of original writing and the earliest copies in our possession. Homer wrote the Iliad in 900 BCE, but our earliest copy is from 400 BCE. That's a difference of 500 years. Aristotle wrote between 384 and 322 BCE, and the earliest copies of his work dates from 1100 CE. That's a gap of 1400 years. In contrast, the New Testament was written, according to McDowell, between 40 and 100 CE, and the earliest copies date from 125 CE, a time span of 25 years. Actually, the earliest copy does not date from 125 CE. It is the earliest fragment, a few verses from the Gospel of John, that dates from then. There is no way to verify from these few verses whether the rest of John or any of the remainder of the New Testament is reliable. Most of the copies of the manuscripts that we have on hand date from a millennium later. So McDowell's implication is misleading. All of this is important when considering the reliability of the text itself. A shorter interval of time allows for fewer corruptions and variations. So why are there so many variants? I mean, if the time was so short. But even if the time interval were extremely brief, it has no relevance to the reliability of the content. If the New Testament should be considered reliable on this basis, then so should the Book of Mormon, which was supposedly written by Joseph Smith, copied by Joseph Smith in 1823 and first published in 1830, a gap of only 7 years. In addition to Joseph Smith, there are signed testimonies of 11 witnesses who claim to have seen the gold tablets on which the angel Moroni wrote the Book of Mormon. We're much closer in history to the origin of Mormonism than to the origin of Christianity. There are millions of copies of the Book of Mormon and a thriving Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with millions of members and billions of dollars in assets to prove its veracity. Though most scholars, pro and con, agree that the current edition of the Book of Mormon is a trustworthy copy of the 1830 version. Few Christian scholars consider it to be reliable history. If we stick to the New Testament, since we have no choice, how much can we know about the Jesus of history? Although the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have been placed first in the current ordering, they were not the first books written, nor were they written in that order. The earliest writings about Jesus are those of Paul, who produced his epistles no earlier than the mid-50s CE. Strangely, Paul, who never met Jesus, mentions very little about the life of the historical Jesus. If Jesus had been a real person, certainly Paul, his main cheerleader, would have talked about him as a man. The Jesus of whom Paul writes is a disembodied spiritual Christ speaking from the sky, not a flesh and blood man of history. Paul never talks about Jesus' parent or the virgin birth or Bethlehem. He never mentions Nazareth, never refers to Jesus as the Son of Man, as commonly used in the Gospels. He avoids recounting a single miracle or deed committed by Jesus, except for reciting the Last Supper ritual. He doesn't fix any historical activities of Jesus in any time or place, makes no reference to any of the 12 apostles by name. He omits the trial and fails to place the crucifixion in a geographical location. Paul rarely quotes Jesus, and this is odd since he used many other devices of persuasion to make his points. There are numerous places in the teachings of Paul where he could have and should have invoked the teachings of Jesus, but he ignores them. He contradicts Jesus' teachings on divorce, 1 Corinthians 7:10, allowing for none, while Jesus permitted exceptions. Jesus taught a Trinitarian baptism in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. But Paul and his disciples baptized in Jesus' name only, which makes perfect sense if the concept of the Trinity was developed later. Paul never claims to have met the pre-resurrected Jesus. In fact, one of the most glaring contradictions of the Bible appears in two different accounts of how Paul supposedly met the disembodied Christ for the first time. The quote-unquote silence of Paul is one of the thorny problems confronting defenders of a historical Jesus. The Christ in Paul's writings is a different character from the Jesus of the Gospels. Paul adds not a speck of historical documentation for the story. Even Paul's supposed confirmation of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 contradicts the Gospels when it says that Jesus was seen of Cephas, Peter, then of the 12. The Gospels were written no earlier than 70 CE, and most likely were written during the 90s CE and later. They all pretend to be biographies of Jesus. No one knows who wrote these books, the names having been added later as a matter of convenience. The writer of Matthew, for example, refers to Matthew in the third person. Neither Mark nor Luke appears in any list of the disciples of Jesus, and we have no way of knowing where they got their information. The general scholarly consensus is that Mark was written first, based on an earlier proto-Mark now lost, which shows that even the earliest gospel contained secondhand data, and that the writers of Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark, adapting and adding to it. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are commonly known as the synoptic gospels, since they have shared common material. The writer of John appears to have been written in isolation, and the Jesus portrayed in his story is a different character. John contains little in common with the other three, and where it does overlap, it's often contradictory. There's very little that can be ascertained from the four Gospels about the historic Jesus. His birthday is unknown. In fact, the year of Jesus' birth cannot be known. The writer of Matthew says Jesus was born in the days of Herod the king. Well, Herod died in 4 BCE. Luke reports that Jesus was born when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. Well, Cyrenius became governor of Syria in 6 CE. That's a discrepancy of at least 9 years. There was no year 0. Luke says Jesus was born during a Roman census, and it is true that there was a census in 6 CE. This would have been when Jesus was at least 9 years old, according to Matthew. There's no evidence of any early census during the reign of Augustus. Palestine was not part of the Roman Empire until 6 CE. Perhaps Matthew was right, or perhaps Luke was right, but both can't be right. Matthew reports that Herod slaughtered all the firstborn in the land in order to execute Jesus. No historian, contemporary or later, mentions this supposed genocide, an event that should have caught someone's attention. None of the other biblical writers even mention it. The genealogies of Jesus present a particularly embarrassing example of why the gospel writers are not reliable historians. Matthew gives a genealogy of Jesus consisting of 28 names from David down to Joseph. Luke gives a reverse genealogy of Jesus consisting of 43 names from Joseph back to David. They each purport to prove that Jesus is of royal blood, though neither of them explains why Joseph's genealogy is relevant if he was not Jesus's father. Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary and the Holy Spirit. Matthew's line goes from David's son Solomon, while Luke's goes from David's son Nathan. The two genealogies could not have been for the same person. Matthew's line is like this: David, Solomon, 11 other names: Josiah, Jeconiah, Shealtiel, Zerubbabel, Abiud, 6 other names: Mathan, Jacob, and Joseph. Luke's line is like this: David, Nathan, 17 other names, none identical to Matthew's list: Melchi, Neri, Shealtiel, Zerubbabel, Risa, 15 other names, none identical to Matthew's list: Mathat, Heli, and Joseph. Some defenders of Christianity assert that this is not contradictory at all, because Matthew's line is through Joseph and Luke's line is through Mary, even though a simple glance at the text shows that they both name Joseph. No problem, says the apologist. Luke named Joseph, but he really meant Mary. Since Joseph was the legal parent of Jesus, and since Jewish genealogies are patrilineal, it makes perfect sense to say that Heli had a son named Joseph, who had a son named Jesus. Believe it or not, many Christians can make these statements with a straight face. In any event, they will not find a shred of evidence to support such a notion. Hold up. Okay, I gotta go. Thanks for watching, guys. This took a little long, ran a little longer than I
than I thought it would. But I be getting carried away. I love this book.